Hello, welcome to a new video. This time we're going to go from Blender to Houdini with Python. If you have seen the last video, we basically now are going to the reverse. So this time around, we want to, of course, start in Blender. So what we're going to build is this menu here on the side. So I have a special tab called Houdini and I have a small menu to launch Houdini or export a model to Houdini. So that is something that we want to replicate. So it's a bit more code required than Houdini because we will need to write some UI elements to actually spawn this panel and these buttons. In Houdini, we can just simply create a shelf tool and just automatically plug something in there. So I will start automatically in Visual Studio and start to code what we will need. So here in Visual Studio Code, let's start coding. So we need to define sort of like a UI element and that panel. So one of the first things just to do, maybe just import the Blender Python. Then once that is done, we will need to set up a few basic things. So now we need to figure out the code to make an actual panel or UI elements. To do that, we can also again look up the documentation. So going to the Blender API documentation with Python, we have something specially for, of course, these panels on the side. So you can see that we will create a class, and this will be the type of a panel. And then we will need to define properties, but what is the name of the panel and so on, like a bunch of things that Blender needs to actually register this as a full panel. You can just see some more examples here about like calling other functions, drawing things and so on. So just useful to see some examples if you want to know more. And also very useful here is actually more explanation about how to use some of the values you need to set, because we will need to set like the category or the naming and so on, because we will need to give that data so Blender can actually properly create the panel. So back into Visual Code, like we have seen in the example, we need to make a class, and then you can give it a name, like my panel, Houdini panel, simple panel. I'm just gonna call it just like a simple panel example. And then we need to define the Blender type. So blender.types.panel. So we need to just say that this is a panel. And then we need to give it some values like we have seen in the documentation. We need to just say what the naming is, what the ID name is, what is the label, what is the category, where does this menu live. So we need to set some Blender values. So we're going to say, so here Blender ID name, and this equals to Houdini panel, for example. Houdini panel. Then we're going to do the category. So get category, and this is then the name of the tab itself. So the name you have here on the side is called the category. So if you want this to be something else, you can just name it over here. If you wanted to extend, like give some more explanation, you can just make the name. I'm just going to keep it short. And then Blender dot slash label. This is then, for example, Houdini menu. And Houdini menu is basically the naming here at the top. Give this a different name. You can just change that there. Then we need something which is called space type, sort of giving some more context where this would be. And this would be view 3D. And then we also need to say the region, so region type. And this will then be UI. So again, if you're not sure about this, you can always double check documentation or some other tutorials about this. But these are some basic properties you need to set to work with that. Then we also need to use the draw function. So this is some code to sort of like try to spawn this, but we also need to use our function to draw. So you can also find this from the documentation. So draw, self, and context. Then in here, we need to say what is our layout. So layout is basically a reference to ourselves, because this will be the main panel where we will create the elements. And then from here in the future, we will then add, for example, we can then just, for example, say layout, and then we're going to say like, hey, add the button here or add something here to this menu or layout. So that is going to be that for now. So we basically now created this class, but right now it doesn't do much. It's just a class that sort of like gives some context about how the panel should be. So we actually need to go into the second part where we're actually going to register the class, where we need to say to spawn this specifically. So there are a few ways we can do this. We can make some functions as well for registering and unregistering. So we can just say register. And then here we are going to say Blender Python .utilities .register class. And then we give it the name of the class, of course. So we are going to register the class so it can actually be used and called. Then we're going to give it also unregister. We can basically actually just copy paste this part. So if you want to unregister this part, we can use the unregister function. So unregister. And to be finishing off, we also need to call one of these. Of course, we want to call the register function, so we can use the if naming equals to main. And then here we're going to just say spawn or trigger the function called register. So this code is ready to be tested for a spin. So we're going to copy everything for now, just to keep it simple. And here in Blender, we're going to just simply open here our text editor on the side. So text editor, make a new text editor, and we're going to copy paste what we created here. So if we should able to run this, we will now be able to see here our menu or tab on the side. As you can see, so we're now seeing these elements. So again, the namings, you can always change the naming here, or you can always change some elements where this specifically would be. But this is basically how we create like a base menu over here. Then of course, let's make a button for this. So we now create, we now created just a simple panel, and now let's place a button in the panel. So for that, I'm going to make a new class, and this can be called send to Houdini or launch Houdini or something like that. So here we're going to make, again, defining the type like we did before. So types, and then here we're going to say operator, because this is different. This will be the button. Then again, we need to define some properties like we did over here, because we need to give this like a name. So here we're going to say Blender ID name, and this is equal to object dot send Houdini. And then continuing here is we want to give this then a label, which is then the actual name of the button, and this can be launch Houdini or send Houdini. So this will then be able to create a button, but we also want to make a function when we click the button. So you want to say if execute is triggered, which is again, you can find some documentation on that as well from the API. So what we can, for example, do is we can just simply trigger like an export. So we can say FBX pad. Let's maybe use an FBX export for now. Previously I used USD. You can also switch this to USD. It's up to you. I'm going to again define your location. I'm just going to hard code this a bit. So I'm going to use the default of tools again. So tools slash and then temp geo, like temporary geometry .fbx. So this is the location where I would like to see my FBX file. Then further, we want to trigger a way to save out the FBX. So you can look again at the documentation, but here we can just say blender.operator.export scene.fbx. This will trigger then the FBX file exporter. So for that, we also need to set a path, file path, and this is equal to my FBX path. What can also be interesting to do is apply like a certain scaling and axis changes. And so here I'm using this export to FBX function, and you can see that we have a bunch of other values to set. So if we want to change the scale or apply different units or do something else with transforms or rotations, we can actually set this here. Because if you are familiar with like using Houdini and Blender or Unreal, there is always like scaling differences and so on. So we can actually apply that here if you want to do that. So for example, we can say that the global scale is, for example, 100 times smaller. So I'm, for example, happy with this. Now we also need to define this to the menu. So we created this class, but it won't do anything by itself. So we need to define the draw here, that we also need to draw that type of class, or we also need to draw that operator. We are going to say at the layout that we would like to add the operator. So layout.operator, and then here we need to give the ID name. Like so. So now that is sort of linked to it. We can also add the register as well. So we're going to specify that we want to register the class as well. So here we can just copy paste the name. Like so. And we can also add this to unregister as well. If you want to unregister, just so unregister. And let's just copy paste the code. So I just opened a new version of Blender, new text editor, new code, go and copy paste the code and press play. So we have some error. Let's see if I mistyped something. So I forgot to say that this is types. So let's click again. And that is running. So let's see if we now have To Houdini, and we now have a Send to Houdini button here. So in theory, if I press this button, I will now have an FBX file on my disk. So I do have an FBX file with my cube, which was, again, we call it stepratio.fbx, but I also did like a get a Python error. So what we actually need to do when we trigger this execute is we also need to say when it is finished. So we want to return the value, just call it finished. So this is something that we need to add here. Also, I need to add the types instead of type. So if I now would copy paste this. So if we now would swap out the code, run the script and export, we know we don't have any errors. So we need to just define when we are sort of like done executing the code on the button. So that part is done. The only part left is to actually launch Houdini now. So if you have watched the previous video, we need to define where Houdini is installed, or where the software is installed, like Houdini Blender, and then we can just call a command line to open that. So here, I'm just going to make a variable called Houdini path, and this equals to your locally installed Houdini. For example, this could be something like program files, .side effects, .your Houdini version. Then in the bin, we have a bunch of Houdini exe files. This is also based on your Houdini version. If you're using Houdini ND, you want to switch this out with Houdini ND. If you're using another version of Houdini like Core or Apprentice, you need to double check which version you actually have. You can just try to just launch Houdini FX and see. So this should be able to launch Houdini. Then we are going to create the command line. So we are going to create the command line. And then in this line, we then have our Houdini path. So Houdini path. And then later on in a moment, I will add also a Python script with this as well to import the mesh that we just exported here. So now that's also, if you press the button, that's also launch Houdini. We need to again import sub process here as well. So sub process. And then here we want to then call sub process dot be open. And we want to just fill in our command line. So we'll just trigger Houdini. So going back here, I'm going to remove and swap the code. Going to press the button again, and let's see if Houdini will launch when I press this button. And it actually is launching. So only thing left is to create like a small code to actually spawn a node. So in Houdini here, I'm going to just make a simple shelf tool to demonstrate the Python code that is required. So let's do a new tool. I'm just going to say like spawn nodes. This is the just like for testing, apply, and we're going to create like a small script here. So let's say I want to spawn the file node. So the file node will be able to load our FBX file. So here we will just point to our tools folder and going to look for the temporary geometry file, which was created from Blender. So we want to set this up here with Python code. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to get the structure of the hierarchy of like creating an object and geometry and then the file node. So we need to spawn the object level. So just going to say object level equals to Houdini dot node, and then we're going to define here that we want to look for or spawn something in the object level. If you want to spawn something in like the stage level or output level, you can just change that here. Then we want to do like geo level, so or geo node maybe, geometry node. This equals to our object level dot create node, and then we need to give this the type of node, which is just geometry, because we want to spawn the geometry node here. So this is just called geometry. And then in the geometry node, we want to spawn our file node. So let's say like file node. So we want to then target our geometry node and dot create node, which is called, we can always again double check it. So this is actually called a file. So we're just going to say create the file node, and let's press accept, and let's try out the tool. So delete everything here in scene and click the button, and as you can see, it basically created those nodes for us. So again, pretty useful to just spawn a couple nodes with Python. Then we also want to set the value from this. So here we're going to look at a parameter called file. So we are going to say the file node dot parameter called file. We want to set this with our custom path. So maybe let's make like a variable here called path to the FBX. So this will be under my tools folder that I created. So slash tools slash temp geometry dot FBX. And this will then be the location I want to use over here. So let's press apply again. We can just delete everything, and if I now spawn the node, we should have our Blender default box here. So this is now working. So this code, I'm going to copy paste this, so Control C. So we want to make a new Python script. So we're going to copy paste the code that we made, just to be sure that we're also importing the Houdini library, just in case that we will need that. So this is the code that is required. So we will just basically spawn the nodes and set this to load the mesh from the geometry. And I'm also going to save this under the tools folder and calling this Houdini import Houdini FBX Python file. So here we want to then reference this into our code. So here we are going to say like Houdini script. This equals to our tools folder. So d slash tools slash that script. So import Houdini FBX.python. And the only thing that we need to do here is just simply add that variable over here, and we're going to copy paste the code. So this in theory, if I now click on this button, should launch Houdini and load the FBX. So let's see. And as you can see, it did launch Houdini and opened that FBX file. So now I have a small tool where I can start modeling something in Blender. And once I want to do something a bit more procedural or using other features of Houdini, I can now just launch the button, trigger this in Houdini, and I now have like a way to get back and forward. One more thing that could be interesting is to maybe add this to a add-on. So here, as you know, Blender has all these add-ons, and you can actually make your own. So we can actually add this to our add-on panel. So to make this as a add-on that we can add to Blender, we need to just define properties at the first lines of code. So we want to type in blender.info or /info is equal to a couple of variables. So we want to set the name of this. So this could be send to Houdini or something like that, like send to Houdini. Then we can, for example, set like a version. So let's say version 1. We can also specify the Blender version. So currently I did build this in version 3.4. So we can just say 3.4.0. Then we can also define, or we can also say where this is located. This will be as a helper or documentation when you view the tool. So this doesn't necessarily define something where it's actually located. So this tool is located in our 3D viewport and next to our toolbar, or it's actually in the toolbar. And then there you will find something which is called Houdini. Then we can also add a description. So this description, and in the description can be like sending the model to Houdini. Then further, maybe we can also set the category. And this could be called anything you want, maybe like Houdini category. And the only thing that we need to do now is just save the file itself, or save this Python file. So I'm just going to save this under my tools folder. Then in Blender, we can go to our edit preferences. We can go to add-ons here, and we want to install a new add-on. So here under my tools folder, I have my add-on Blender Python script. So we can just click on this and we can install add-on. So now we have installed this module. So here on the side, we don't have our Houdini tab. So if I enable this, we will now have our Houdini tab. So this way, it's like building your Blender by default. So you don't have to like open this thing and run a script or something like that. It will just be sitting here on the side. So you can just do your normal like poly modeling and so on, do some basic geometry editing and so on. And you can just now click send to Houdini. And we will now have this model in Houdini. That was it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to like and subscribe. See you in the next one.